Hello, and welcome to another episode of Defense Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and issues in laser-focused detail so that you build an accurate and informative big picture. This week, we'll be talking about the Pakistan Army's new Rocket Force Command. So no doubt, precision-guided surface-to-surface missiles played a key role in the recent conflict between Pakistan and India, especially with the BrahMos supersonic cruising missile posing a real problem for Pakistan. So, in tandem with air power, it seems that Pakistan has formalized its intent to build land-based guided strike capabilities, with homegrown systems like the Fatah series being a focal point. It's a break from how Pakistan had historically managed this capability, with the bulk of it being for primarily strategic purposes. But now, especially through the Fatah family, it wants to use these capabilities for conventional purposes. We also know that this land-based strike capability will leverage a mix of guided 300mm and 600mm rockets like the Fatah 1 and Fatah 2, but also the ground-launched cruise missile like the Fatah 4. So from a vision standpoint, we know Pakistan wants to build a varied long-range strike capability from land, and at least ideally at scale with tactics like saturation strikes and mass salvos rather than isolated attacks. The question is, however, can it get there? Is a genuine dedicated Rocket Force Command a realistic goal for the Pakistan Army? What will it take to ensure this new force structure delivers on its promise? For that and much more, I have with me Asim Islam, an aerospace engineer based in the US, and myself, the head of Kuwa in Canada. Arslan had an urgent assignment, so he won't be joining us this week. Hi Asim, how are you?
Good, great to be here.
So let's just dive right in. So why did the Pakistan Army, you think, form the Rocket Force Command?
I think it's always important to look at history. Regardless of which side you choose to believe, Pakistan or India, there's a certain pattern. We had the 2016 surgical strikes that India called, right? Pakistan denied anything happened. But, something happened, or at least India claimed something happened. But this was very low level, just based on alleged incursion of ground forces. Right? Then 2019 Balakot, right? So that was an escalation on the surgical strikes, right? So there was a very limited airstrike in 2019, right? And Pakistan shot down an aircraft when it crossed over into Pakistan, right? And then there was a massive escalation that we saw in 2025. I'm seeing a pattern of escalation, right? So 2016, 2019, 2025. So things are escalating, whether we like it or not. So we have to keep that in mind. So why is that happening? We've always, been told and, thought about nuclear deterrence as being able to prevent war. Now, in a sense, it has been successful in that mission, right? Because there has been no major war between India and Pakistan. However, I feel there's a failure of nuclear deterrence, or at least a small modification in the deterrence, or like a hole that India has found, like a space. So India keeps saying we've made a new normal. And what they're saying is they've essentially found a space below the nuclear threshold to engage militarily with Pakistan. And they found this space incrementally, right? So they did surgical strikes, they did Balakot, and then they did 2025, right? So they were poking and trying to find this sub-nuclear space to be, engaged militarily with Pakistan. Now, on Pakistan's end, basically one of the reasons for developing nuclear weapons was Pakistan could never hope to match India conventionally. But what these recent developments are showing is Pakistan needs to, pick up its game in the conventional sphere as well, because the nuclear deterrence is preventing large-scale war, but there is a pattern of escalating conflict that may or may not actually eventually lead to nuclear war. Who knows, because escalation is crazy once you get to the higher rungs of the ladder. So I just feel like that's why, that's the background of why we sort of need in our armed forces Rocket Force Command. So it's an attempt to build a conventional deterrence in addition to the nuclear deterrence that we have.
I agree. And I think when you look at a lot of the statements that came out following the conflict from Pakistan's side, specifically figures like the chairman, Joint Chief Staff Committee, the retired Pakistan Air Force officials, and even if you follow, let's say, some of the recently retired army generals, namely like brigadiers at that level, you get a sense that there's a bit of an internal debate happening on whether Pakistan should be more preemptive moving forward as opposed to purely reactive, and number two, and more strategically, whether it needs to take the onus of de-escalation and diplomacy at all. So I think if you look back to the Joint Chief Staff, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs statements in the Shangri-La conference, he was basically saying this, in my opinion, implicitly, he was saying that in the next conflict, unless there is an internationally managed crisis management, so that's number one, it's not going to come from Pakistan anymore. It has to be internationally managed. Unless that exists, the next conflict will be devastating, meaning that whatever India will do, Pakistan will respond, or potentially, and this is where you kind of connect it to the statements of people like Air Marshal Amir Masood, who's retired, for example, or even to an extent Air Chief Marshal Sohail Aman's statements, it's where there needs to be this measure of moving the escalation ladder up on your end and preempting. So if you identify, for example, that there's a mobilization, I think that, I think one of the things that Indians had said, I believe, was that China had provided, for example, real-time ISR or intelligence surveillance reconnaissance information to Pakistan regarding some vectors that India was deploying. I think some within the Pakistani side would have loved on their end, or rather thought that if they had information on these vectors, they should have had an ability to first engage them, neutralize them, or attack them, and then open the doors to diplomacy, right? To establish that, yeah, we know that you're moving this stuff around, and we'll preempt it when we want. Like, we reserve the right to preempt it, and we will preempt it. And for that, it sounds like gradually each of the service arms is going to be maintaining its own dedicated strike capability to be able to own that on their function. So basically, the Army should not have to call on the Air Force to go and do this. The Navy should not have to call on the Air Force or the Army to do this. It'll have its own strike capabilities. And now the Army has that ability now as well within the Rocket Force Command, where there would be command structure with very clear directives and mandates to be able to basically start engaging those, just act on that real-time ISR information, for example, to be able to preempt, to identify those BrahMos launchers or whatever and to hit them sooner, to identify those loitering munitions launch zones and hit them, and so on and so forth. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. Right, so let me just expand on what we've discussed so far. What I was pointing out was there's a gap in deterrence, nuclear or conventional, that existed. So let's analyze, and we've talked about this before as well, but what happened was on May 7th, there was intense conflict led by the PAF, right? And then what followed was 3 days of strikes, as you pointed out, from vectors on the Indian side, right? So BrahMos, tons of loitering munitions. What Pakistan was, and the most Pakistan was able to do was let them launch, and we saw in the press conferences, right? We were tracking all of those as well, right? We were seeing those, and we were just waiting for them to come hit us, or then we would maybe intercept them, right? So I think in retrospect, I sort of see this as well, that at that point, Pakistan Army was indeed wishing that they had some ability to hit back and, kinetically hit those vectors before the launch, right? Because the intelligence was obviously there. And there's another aspect in terms of deterrence. I keep bringing up deterrence because it's important. And so on May 7th, there was a big response from Pakistan, right? And then what followed was 3 days of basically only defensive responses from Pakistan and statements like, we'll respond to the time and place of our choosing and whatnot, right? And I believe that was a function of the fact that Pakistan Army had no way of responding in force conventionally. It was only on the night of May 10th, 9th and 10th, right? When India kept escalating, they were essentially controlling the escalation ladder. That at that point, Pakistan brought out its Fatah 1s and Fatah 2s. Now, I know Fatah 1s and Fatah 2s have never been, advertised as being strategic weapons, but at that point, there was no separation of, nuclear or conventional rockets. So it was almost like Pakistan was skipping a few steps on the escalation ladder. And I believe that's what, caused the entire world to panic and, forced the world to say, oh, you guys need to stop, right? And I'm sure that, even India saw Pakistan, skipping a few steps and going on the escalation ladder. And the reason Pakistan was skipping those steps was because Pakistan had no conventional response to India's conventional strikes, starting May 7th and going to May 9th.
So I think broadly, if we look at just the name itself and the idea of this dedicated rocket strike, let's say subcommand within the army, I think it does borrow to a pretty notable extent from the Eastern, especially the Chinese approach. I would say actually specifically the Chinese approach. And the reason why I say that is that when you look into the Chinese rocket forces, for example, their mandate is to contribute towards China's anti-access area denial lines. So the whole idea is they want to not just deny enemy controlling capability and mobilization capability within their immediate sphere, right? Let's say within their border regions or within, the South China Sea, but they want to push those lines even farther to the Eastern Pacific, right? So they want to push it further into Southeast Asia, all the way up to like the second and first island chains, essentially. And I think the way the army might, or someone in the army, I would say, might be thinking along the lines of, is we know the BrahMos is a threat, not just because of its intrinsic qualities of being a supersonic cruising missile. That's one factor, but because it could be deployed so close to the border that it creates a very, very maybe unrealistically tight response space for the air defense systems to address. So what if we can try building a bit of a quasi buffer through an anti-access area denial net into Indian territory? So if the Indians perceive that any launcher or mobilization site could get struck up to, let's say, and I don't think the Rocket Command's limit is going to be 750 kilometers. I think their goal in the long run is to get to that 2,000, 2,500 kilometers. That's really where it would be the safest for them to, or rather than, when we're talking about conventional deterrence, the word deterrence implies you want to ensure the maximum exertion is sort of implied in your response, right? Like you wouldn't just say, yeah, we're going to cover up to 300 kilometers. Like that's completely deflates the purpose. So I think even from that conventional deterrence standpoint, they want to reach quite far into India or have the ability to do so, which in theory, and again, this is just theoreticals, we're not going to go and say like India would respond in this way. It might have found another way of circumventing this, but maybe just from Pakistan's perspective, maybe that forces the Indians to then deploy those missiles much further back, let's say up to 1,000 kilometers back, right, from within India. So then that gives you a bit of that space. So I think that's one aspect where you are essentially pushing your A2 AD lines forward. And I think that's like one of the, if there's one lesson Pakistan could adopt from the Chinese, which would be worth it in its specific scenario, it's that idea of don't just make anti-access area denial about your immediate vicinity. Keep pushing those lines forward with the right assets. And maybe at a doctrine level, Army's Rocket Command Force is sort of trying to speak towards that goal. I think that's like number one. And number two, from in an ongoing conflict with India, I think this unit or this force would then, if it sees, let's say those BrahMos vectors going live, it would target and attack them. If it sees some other, let's say Indian ballistic missile units going live, it'll target and attack them. And for this to work effectively, Pakistan would need to finally take control of its real-time ISR capabilities, especially in terms of space and ground surveillance. So definitely we know that, for example, the recent satellite that was launched is a synthetic aperture radar equipped satellite. So just for some reference to those who might not be familiar with it, a synthetic aperture radar is basically like a surface facing, ground facing imaging system that uses radio waves to help you pick up images or to produce images. However, because that satellite is through Saparco, it has a lot of civilian connotations. There might be, if you're trying to mix it with civilian and military purposes, you muddy the waters. There might be some bandwidth issues. I think now especially, and if the Chinese are sort of taking a more active role in advising the Pakistan military on more strategic things, which increasingly seems to be the case in my perspective, I think down the line the military is going to start maintaining dedicated satellites of their own for both imaging and communications. It just sounds like that's the natural progression, and some of the infrastructure is already there, like the PAF's Space Command. But that was, I think, through the use of the existing shared civilian satellites. I think now they've understood that, okay, we need dedicated, for this to work, you need those dedicated real-time capabilities.
Yeah, and I think, let me just interject here. What you're basically, and it is a good point, right? I do suspect that this is what's going on, or at least this is one of the objectives of setting up the RFC, but this is essentially strategic depth. But now we're looking at strategic depth inside India, right? Not inside of Afghanistan, but inside India. I thought that was a funny way of looking at it.
Absolutely, and it is I wouldn't say implied, it's just sort of the de facto situation, but when you're sandwiched between two pretty big territories, I mean, India's a continent, essentially, Afghanistan's pretty big in itself, you're basically left with few options, and then it's sort of the approach that you see Israel taking, essentially, and Israel's actually just straight up taking territory at this point to build its strategic depth from the ground up, right? So it's very brazen, very obvious. And then in Pakistan's case, it's like you'll have to sort of create an imagination of it, the way the Chinese do it with their anti-access area denial lines. It's like, yeah, the Pacific, South China Seas, Southeast Asia, yes, they're technically independent areas. Yes, it's technically free for everybody. But if you post a military ship there, that's not good. And in a war, we will target those areas. And I think that is essentially the lesson the Pakistan army is sort of getting from China, is to create that sense that if you try to use your own territory to attack us, it's going to be a problem. And I think it's valid to an extent to start thinking and even expressing this view, because that's what India does to you, right? India in May literally just did that very clearly. Didn't just target the disputed areas along the LOC, it literally targeted Punjab, your heartland. And that is a red line in the sense of not just in terms of the forcing the armed forces to respond, obviously, but it's also a red line in terms of thought process. Because now I think people need to also understand that Pakistan has a hawkish group. I mean, maybe people like defense enthusiasts see it the most because we interact with those people, but they get filtered out as you go up the chain in governance in the military. But it exists. The Hamid Guls of the world, they exist. They existed, right? And they continue to exist. It's just that their voices are not given. However, that being said, I think the army leadership and then the hawks among them, one who came on the Air Marshal Amr Masood, that's like the kind of approach. He's like, if you targeted 20, 30 planes, shoot them down. That's the approach. So I think that voice has been given a bit of legitimacy, and the ones who can sort of guide those people to sort of build the right doctrines and approaches to substantiate that would be the Chinese, I think. And I think we're starting to see a lot of that overlap gradually show up in Pakistan. I think the Army Rocket Force Command is just one example. There might be more down the line as well. I know some of you have some comments, so I just want to preface the next question here, and because it might be related to what you have to say. But why did the army have to build a separate strike capability independent of the PAF?
Yeah, what you said reminded me of something. We get the general sense that in the May conflict, the Indian Air Force was caught off guard by what PAF did on May 7th. And I believe the reason was exactly what you said, right? Acted more hawkishly than it did in 2019, right? And I pointed this out earlier as well. Instead of waiting for the Indian aircraft to cross over, which they were not planning to, PF decided, no, we're going to shoot you down in your territory, right? So there was a change in mindset to a more hawkish behavior. And I think if that, and as PF said, this order came directly from the air chief, right? So this hawkish thinking is making way to the very top. So I believe the same thinking is also making its way in the army as well. And our rocket force, as you said, is probably a reflection of that desire.
So now with that in mind, what do you think were the reasons why this strike capability had to be built independently of the PAF? I mean, I think one aspect we could argue is that, okay, how how often are you going to call on the PAF to go and attack things, right? But I think there might be another aspect to it as well, which we'll get on into a little bit later. But it sounds like the army wants to take more of a end-to-end ownership role of its, I guess, strike responsibilities. Or do you imagine there's a bit of a delineation or separation now happening in terms of priorities between the Air Force and the Army in terms of what they want to attack and engage?
That might be a factor, but I also think that there's a certain capability gap as well. And what I mean is, so Pakistan is not a big country, and Pakistan's Air Force, even though much, relatively speaking, is quite large, it's not large enough to take on all of the Indian Air Force if it came to that, right? So what that implies is PF tries to create these, local pockets of numerical superiority and technological superiority over the IAF, and then engage in battles. That's the entire PF, doctrine. But, with the limited number of aircraft that it can possibly operate, the Pakistan Army cannot rely on the PF to provide its support. Yes, PF can, do some things in its domain, but it's not like the, USAF that, has dedicated, squadrons of tens or something, right? The PF, it can do some, support roles for the army, but there's only so much the PF can do in the Indo-Pak context, because PF will have their hands full with the IAF. Again, I keep going back to the May conflict because A, it's recent, and B, there were a lot of good lessons there. So on May 7th, we saw this big kerfuffle within the air forces, right? There was a big battle, lots of planes shot down, and on the Indian side. And then on May 8th, May 9th, we basically saw no, flying from either side. And or very limited flying from either side, right? And the reason for that was in this low-scale conflict, it's exceedingly embarrassing to lose an aircraft, especially over the enemy territory, right? I mean, we know what happened with Abhinandan in 2019, right? So obviously India didn't want that, and Pakistan didn't want to give India that, that sort of victory, even though, one or two aircraft don't mean anything in terms of, strategic warfare. But in this low-level conflict, perceptions are what matters most. So it's important to not lose aircraft. And what that meant was the air forces were not engaging each other after May 7th. And so the Indian Army obviously had a conventional response independent of their air force, right? They had tons of BrahMos, they had tons of loitering munitions that they kept lobbing onto Pakistan all through those 3 days, right? But on the Pakistani side, the Pakistan Army, the PF wasn't going to fly its aircraft and go do deep strike missions into Indian territory and lose their aircraft. And the Pakistan Army did not have a conventional response. So I think that's one of the big reasons that Pakistan Army wants its own ability to, strike targets within India.
I agree. And I think also there is a bit of an evolution in how the PAF views itself. So I just think back to statements of Air Chief Marshal Sohail Aman following the conflict. I think the PAF as a whole wants to move into more of what we would call a strategic impact force. So in this case, your air power isn't for taking out that random bridge over there or the radar over there. Rather, it's about thinking in broader terms, figuring out how to deprecate Indian air power, right? How to limit India's ISR, how to unwind India's electronic warfare. And that's a very different approach to air warfare than the traditional put the troops on the ground sort of approach. I think, and even I would say independent air power, right? It's even different to that, because maybe with independent air power, you would have still been independent, but you'd still target a wider swath of, enemy installations and whatnot without tying it back to like a bigger goal. And obviously, it goes back to your, to an extent, to the boots theory, which you discussed, was that, at least on the upfront, getting those aircraft assets is expensive, and you do want to use them in a very calibrated way, not just, and it's impossible to use them in a very aggressive, widespread way unless you have like a lot of aircraft to sustain those sorties with. So with the Air Force, especially as you go into more and more advanced platforms, especially the next generation fighter aircraft platforms, you're going to deal with longer downtimes, longer turnaround times and sort of things. So your ability to mount that air power becomes more and more let's say like not as like the space keeps growing between the time you have your sortie and the time you can deploy your next big sortie, and there's so many different factors going into it, which is why I think the Air Force started investing in air defense, right? Finally, it's because they saw that like how like we have even the JF-17 compared to an F-7, it's still a much more advanced platform. How can you depend on this fighter which is going to go through downtime around the clock? Whereas an air defense system can be active around the clock even after expiring its missile salvo. You can reload it pretty quickly and get it back up. So I think there's that aspect as well, where the army has identified that it is going to have to engage such a wide array of targets, and these will change throughout the nature of the conflict itself. That it just cannot depend on the Air Force to keep coming up, because the Air Force is just not equipped for that role. I mean, its job has changed basically by nature of its technology. So I think we can go up to the next question, which I think Asim, you have a lot to say about. But knowing now that the army has a rocket force command, can Pakistan properly sustain or support such a thing? And to sustain and support it, what would it need to do?
Yeah, so I think we've discussed at length why Pakistan needs a rocket force command, but we need to talk about, can Pakistan support an armed forces rocket force command? So I'm going to go on a tangent. I did this before as well, but it's worth repeating. I mean, before the establishment of RFC, Pakistan's, delivery systems were only or primarily strategic in nature. Let's say Pakistan generously has 200 nuclear weapons, right? Now let's suppose 36 of these are dedicated to, to be deployed on bombers and rods. I'm just taking an example, right? The rest would be on, various versions of Shaheen as well, right? So let's say 36. And you'll see why I chose that number. Now, since 2007, which is when the Rod was first tested, even if Pakistan was producing one bomber and one Rod since 2007, you would have 36, Rods and bombers today, and that would be good enough to deliver your nuclear arsenal. So, I mean, I want the listeners to keep in mind the ridiculously low levels of production that you need to, have delivery systems for nuclear weapons, right? Because you have so few nuclear weapons that you barely need any production. And one or two, or maybe two or three systems per year you can do that, inside of a lab. You don't need a factory or a production line for that sort of production rates, right? So it is very likely that SPD organizations have very limited ability to produce things, right? So they probably have sort of labs that are bordering on assembly lines, but they're essentially labs that produce maybe 2 or 3 systems each year, right? So let's think about conventional strike, right? So maybe you'll want to use 36 bombers and rods in one day, right? That's not the total number that you need. That's the number you need in a single day if you're going to use them conventionally, right? And maybe in a conflict that lasts over a week or something, you probably maybe need 100 or 200 bombers and rods, right? So you need to produce a lot of these delivery methods. So I kept bringing up bombers and rods because they have a nuclear role. But we also have Fatah 1s and Fatah 2s. They're also being produced or assembled or produced by SPD organizations that are geared towards producing very low numbers of strategic assets. The real question is, can Pakistan, SPD organizations produce enough Fatah 1s and Fatah 2s that it can launch 20, 30 each day? Not just 20, 30 or on the last day of the conflict, right? So it needs like a stockpile that goes into hundreds of these systems. Yeah.
Agreed. And I think, while the Fatah family is central to this, it's pretty much been, I think, joined to the hip with the Rocket Force Command stuff. I think when it comes to, if they're serious about the Rocket Force Command, they'll likely need to buy large stocks of missiles from overseas in the near term, obviously from China, because for one thing, they're the only country that will be willing to supply such missiles in those numbers. But at the same time, and I think we'll go into this a bit later, China has that surplus industrial capacity, so it could likely make those tactical surface-to-surface missiles, ground-launched cruise missiles, or even air-launched cruise missiles relatively cheaply. So that's one aspect. And I think it wouldn't surprise me if this Rocket Force Command thing is serious. And this is going to be a pretty big litmus test right here, I think, for people to keep an eye on. That if they're serious about building the actual capability that they will need in a war, that they would realize right away that the domestic production base isn't there. So they're going to need to offload, at least in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years from the Chinese. Besides the rocket stuff, I think and even besides subsonic cruise missiles, I think one area they'll want to look at as well is supersonic cruise missiles, just to build that analogous capability to BrahMos. Obviously, we discussed much earlier that it would not be a prudent step in the sense that ideally Pakistan would skip to hypersonics, but I also believe there's another argument where when you look at the South Asian theater, perception matters a lot, both for the domestic audience and let's say the adversarial audience. But weird to say that's what South Asian fights are. It's a lot of show, right? There's a lot of showbiz going around it. And I think if there's a statement that could be made that, hey, India can launch the BrahMos, but Pakistan can respond with the CM302 or HD1, that does help build a little bit of a sense of parity, at least domestically, that we have a supersonic cruise missile as well. So I could see the army potentially looking into buying a pretty seizable load of these missiles from China, especially since there's an opportunity to potentially acquire them relatively cost effectively, at least compared to other suppliers. There's some caveats there too, but I don't see any other way for them to provision the Army Rocket Force Command this rapidly other than to import a large stockpile of missiles up front.
Yeah. So as I pointed out, SPD organizations, right? So let me just say that, yes, it goes without saying that Pakistan does not have the industrial capacity that you need to establish the ARFC, right? And I've explained why that is so. It's not some kind of weird corruption scandal or anything like that. It's just a function of the needs of the time, right? There was no need to produce so many weapons, right? But with the establishment of the ARFC, now there is a need. So obviously, or very likely, SPD is not geared towards the production of, high rates of these systems, right? It is geared towards a very low rate production. And now I believe the army is going to come and say to them, hey, we need a lot more systems than you are producing right now, or we need them at a much higher rate. And I feel like state-owned SOEs are really inefficient for this, because to start a production line, you need lots of workers. You don't need skilled workers. You just need lots of workers. And let's pretend SOE needs to establish a production line for a missile system, right? So what they'll end up doing is they'll buy some land, or they'll have some land, they'll build a factory. There'll be, hundreds of people concerned with security of that place. It will be inside, a protected complex somewhere, maybe, close to the mountains. And then it'll be a factory, and they'll hire 200 people. There'll be government employees. They'll have pensions, and their only job will be to assemble Fatah ones, right? And because of the way the supply chains work in Pakistan, right, because everything is so restricted, they'll have the productivity that is very low compared to, let's say, if you were to transfer all this to a private enterprise, right? So there are ways that we can, offload some of this work to private enterprises, and we'll get into that later. And I'm sure Bilal has a lot to say on that. But what I want to, preface that with is by saying that, state-owned enterprises will be really inefficient for the production, rates that will be needed for ARFC. They were fine. So it was fine to produce these in labs when you only need 2 or 3 systems per year. But if you need, 30, 40, 50, 60, or 100 systems per year, these aren't going to be great. Now, the pessimist in me, the fear that I have is that, whatever we just discussed, this is a realization on some level in the higher command of the Pakistan Army. So there was a realization. Some orders were definitely passed, right? So it is a thing now. The Rocket Force is a thing. But then the prerequisite, steps that you need, like setting up the production, or, setting up a supply chain from China, those things might not happen, right? Because maybe someone, might decide, hey, we're talking about deterrence, right? So we only need to scare India and not actually have the capability because we don't have the money for it. So maybe that decision gets made. So that's my fear. But I also view this as a great opportunity, right? Because when you were producing, let's say, one barber per year, you had no scope or opportunity to involve the private sector. There was no incentive, right? But now let's say you want to produce Fatah 4s, right? The new barber that has been called the Fatah 4, right? And you want to use it conventionally. Maybe you want to produce 50 of those each year. Now there's there's sufficient scale for you to transfer some of the inputs. Like, let's say you started with the aerostructure, right? You just, release a tender. You ask one of the companies in private sector companies in Pakistan, just make the aerostructure. And this will be a weird example, but one of the most vibrant, private sector companies in Pakistan is Millat Tractors. They start with import parts, but gradually, almost everything in their tractor is now produced inside Pakistan. So that's what we're hoping will happen with the production of these systems. So, for example, SPD could say, hey, we need the aerostructure for Fatah 4s, 50 of those each year. Can Millet Tractors set up a line for that and just give us that? That would be a huge load off SPD organizations, right? And eventually, I'm sure once you start giving these large orders that are sustained, these are guaranteed orders over long periods of time, right? If these orders are sustained, eventually the private company will go, hey, this actuator that we're importing or smuggling from abroad costs $10,000. We could probably reverse engineer this and produce maybe not something not as good, but something for maybe $200, right? Initially, it might not be as great as the import part, but eventually it'll get there. And that's how basically my understanding of how you build up a local small industry. And I feel like the establishment of this RFC is a great opportunity to establish such an industry. And I know, Bill, you'll have a lot to say on this.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with you. And I think we kind of touched upon this in some of our previous episodes, but I'm going to be a bit more upfront about this. But if there's a lesson that we should copy from India that they're applying right now, at least from my perception, is this lesson right here. That when it comes to your government jobs, and remember in South Asia and even in Canada, I would say, government jobs are like the golden ticket. Like you get a good salary throughout your career, a pretty good livable salary. However, what India is doing with these golden tickets is that they're gradually limiting who can get them. And they're not limiting it necessarily based on your family, your ethnicity, this or that. They're trying to unwind all these quota systems, which I think it's to their credit. And instead, they're trying to give this ticket to their best scientists, to their best engineers, to their best doctors, to their best surgeons, and so on and so forth, right? The people who get in both their top universities and end up working in places like Hindustan Aeronautic Limited, in ISRO, in so on and so forth. And it's been a gradual shift, but I would argue that you're beginning to see the fruits of this. Because before, their state-owned enterprises were very similar to Pakistan. They were basically, unfortunately, but they're basically places where you would just dump people, like your party supporters or your constituents and what have you, to keep them happy so they keep voting for you. And this was unfortunately one of the negative shifts that happened in Pakistan in the 70s. So in the 70s, before the 70s, like in the 50s and 60s, Pakistan's private sector and even its government sector was much more tuned in the sense of giving those golden tickets to the scientists and engineers, which is how you got Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, for example, right? That emerged literally through that, right? That's how you got the, to an extent, much lesser extent, because they were not invested in it. They were not, relatively speaking, they got much less investment in the nuclear program. But that's how you got NESCOM and Air Weapons Complex and all these entities as well. But again, these were much smaller compared to the nuclear stuff. Unfortunately, things like Pakistan steel mills or PIA were then used as dumping grounds for constituents, unfortunately. And that's where you get these inefficient state-owned enterprises. So I think we should maintain state-owned enterprises as a principle, but they should be for very specific things. I would rather our best engineers, our best and brightest, are the ones who get those golden tickets, so that when they sit in NESCOM and all its subdivisions, that they're actually focused on R&D and just R&D. they become R&D powerhouses, right? That's where their budget goes. Because as you said, we deal with a lot of controlled technologies that we cannot easily get off the open market, and you have to end up smuggling them. Well, I'd rather the money that would have gone into maintaining the jobs of 20,000 workers go into acquiring those hypersensitive controlled instrumentation systems or tooling equipment and what have you, so that we can design and build, or at least design and prototype and validate those next generation platforms, right? That's what the government and institutions should be doing. We want the best and brightest to get the golden ticket and to stay within the country. That's my principle. Now, that being said, we need to scale production. We need to up our output. We need to also support the wider economy. How do you do that? That's where you get the private sector to come in. So here's the thing, right? If Pakistan, and not if, it will need thousands of these missiles up front as a procurement order, and then as they get used, it'll need large scale distributed production to help replenish its stocks immediately after a conflict, or even, you never know, during a conflict, but that might be untenable because of how close we are to India, that those production facilities will probably get destroyed. But nonetheless, in peacetime, we need them to come back up online and start producing those weapons again. Now, you have two options. One is, which unfortunately might be the more probable course, but we hope it wouldn't be, is that the state takes on the production capacity. So NESCOM ends up having to set up a bunch of factories out here and there. It's going to have to manage, like, in its life cycle, 20,000, 30,000 jobs. So it's not just upfront. Like, you have, like, even if the plant has, like, 1,000 people, those people will gradually retire. They're going to get to pension. The next 1,000 people are going to come up. It's like this the problem that entities like Pakistan Ordnance Factories face, basically, or even Heavy Industries Textile, right? They face this kind of issue. That's why if you look at Pakistan's defense budget, so much money goes into pensions, right? Or even the government budget, like so much, like billions of dollars go into pensions, right? Every year. So what you're doing is basically you're taxing the people who are able to work now in the private sector to pay for those who were living off the public exchequer for their lives, and then through a job, but nonetheless they lived off the public exchequer, and then they retired, and now they're still living off the public exchequer as if they didn't get anything before that. So as you can see, I'm very much against this, right? I don't believe it. Anyways, just be quick about it. So
let me just interject.
Yeah.
Let me just interject
Yeah.
one thing. What you pointed out is absolutely true, and there is a realization in the government and in SPD organizations that pensions are a huge drain on the exchequer, right? Their budgets are, difficult because of pensions, and I've pointed this out. They've actually started to take half measures to correct these things. And there's a reason why I say half measures. So, for example, you could go online and search for Qaswa Industries or something like that. And that's basically an attempt by Air Weapons Complex to offload their production capacity to an organization that has workers that are not government employees. And so, that's primarily that's the objective of setting that place up. But the thing is, this is only, and the reason I say this is a half measure is because it's not just the pensions, right? There's like 20 other things that you pointed out, and you will point out, that are, wrong when you're, putting something under an SOE, right? Because to work at that organization, you still need, to go through, years of security clearances. You probably need to know. The management at that place is probably still from those state-owned organizations, right? And it's still not geared towards making a profit, right? So it's still written off as a header on the balance sheet of the state-owned organizations. So it's yes, the people working there don't, or at least the workers there don't have pensions anymore. Okay, so you maybe solved a tiny bit of the problem, but you didn't really solve the problem. So that's why I call it a half measure. And yeah, so unfortunately, we have seen, Pakistan taking these half measures, and we're hoping that they'll take the full measures that you're
exactly. So when you have, and just a quick side point about the pension. So even if the pensions are taken off the direct budget of NESCOM, the problem is that it's still someone's budget that's going to be used for the pensions. So that's where you end up just looking at the government's fiscal budget. That's like $2-3 billion every year and going into something that we just can't use immediately. It's going into the past, not to surface the future. And that's the problem. And there's a way to solve that fairly for everybody. We'll have a future episode, I imagine, on pension funds, which I think That's when our podcast is really getting into some next tier territory, because we'll be the only ones talking about Pakistani pension funds at that point. However, let's say you do have, a requirement for thousands of missiles, right? Now, obviously, one option is to set up expanded public sector infrastructure, which is through NESCOM. But as we said, that's going to be a lot of dead weight on them in the long run, and which will eventually, not just eventually, it'll continue to detract them from their main work. So the risk is when you expand the public sector to take on these worker jobs, so to speak, and let's be frank here, these are not like advanced technicians who are going to be working in the factories. There's going to be people who are going to screw a bolt somewhere. The problem is it becomes like constituent dumping territory, right? It becomes a place where you dump people to make them happy. And then that ends up creating a lot of toxic situations, and you end up with a bunch of Pakistan steel mills / PIA situations, which we don't want, especially not in the defense sector. Option number 2 is you offload the production side to the private sector. So let's say you get NESCOM and its entities to focus purely on R&D and design and development, which they're pretty good at, and you get them to really double down so that they can start focusing on more complex systems, like potentially like a next generation SAM system, potentially a ramjet powered air-to-air missile, whatever. Point being that they focus on the R&D side, right? And then they contract out the production to the private sector. Now, you would say, well, like, how does it change anything? The private sector, someone will still have to spend on setting up the factories and stuff, right? That is true. It's just that it's going to be the private sector, not the government. So when the private sector sees that there's incentive from sustained government orders that go through the long term without end, they're consistent, they're reliable. These are good big ticket items, relatively speaking, for the Pakistani market. Then you're going to get investors, both domestic and I would even argue potentially foreign investors, because it's such a big golden goose of an opportunity. But let's say domestic investors who will move their money out of places like real estate, out of agriculture, out of wholesale, retail, whatever, and finally invest in manufacturing, right? And the thing is about the private sector is that the incentive structure for an investor is very different from a government bureaucrat, right? Or a general, because the investor wants to make a return on their investment. They want their money to come back and they want to make a profit, right? So their approach to efficiency, making sure, so instead of having the one guy on the factory line screwing in a bolt, they're going to try to automate it, for example, because they don't want to deal with the pensions later on, right? They're going to look at quality control, so they don't deal with like the army sending stuff back to them because it doesn't work. They're going to deal with a lot of these little small things that will amount to a lot in the way of savings and stuff. Now you will argue, now it's true that once they invest in these production facilities and whatnot, they're going to essentially pin the price of that on every Fatah or Rad or Taimur or whatever being built. That is true. That's the overhead. They want to make a return on their investment, right? They're not a charity. However, because you're talking about working within Pakistan, where your currency is cheaper, where your labor is cheaper, right? Where maybe even the inputs that you source are cheaper, and we'll get to that. I think Asim touched on that as well. I'll just elaborate. So let's say you're a factory, you want to build this one like automation arm or something. Yeah, you can import it from Japan, maybe even off the open market. It's maybe not even that expensive, right? However, maybe some kids within Pakistan at NUST decide to take a stab at developing their own robotic arm. Maybe they decide to import some of the inputs from China to do it. Suddenly that same arm, locally designed and built, becomes, is 1/3 the cost of what it would have cost from Japan. And guess what? The investor would have invested in that little R&D project because they want that arm. It's directly tied to their business model. So now you're opening up the floodgates for organic R&D within the civilian space through this model without the government paying a single penny towards it, right? The government just has to go and buy its weapons, whatever. But it's the private sector that wants to constantly grow and become efficient and advanced that's going to be driving this. And this is what you see in India. This is why India is able to produce a truck ton of these scientists, engineers that get like hunted down everywhere else by headhunters around the world, right? That's why the American industries, European industries want these guys, right? Because they're doing these projects for the Indian private sector. Right, this is what we need to learn. You can make fun of India all you want, but don't make fun of the whole thing. At least evaluate it objectively and take the good stuff that's there. There's nothing wrong with taking this like efficiency practices that are working, right, and then maybe even improving upon them. So that being said, the private sector goes on and builds these production facilities. They're focused on efficiency, so they're not going to take on empty pensions. They might work on different approaches. They might, for example, give their best workers some equity in the business down the line, right? So that incentivizes the workers to do well. They'll only hire the competent people, right? And then again, you're causing this ripple effect of incentives changing throughout society. So instead of Pakistani families training their kids to go and get a government job and then just like go get a worker job, sit relax. You'll have a break every Friday for chai after Jummah prayers, and then you can go home. Like, no, none of that's gonna happen. Instead, these parents will be telling their kids, like, go do some technical studies, go do some engineering, go do some whatever, right? Get a job at these companies. They're telling you what they need, right? In fact, sometimes it's heartbreaking for me to hear, because I hear about some private sector companies like in Sialkot saying that they have jobs available. People don't want to work because people want to go and get the easy job, right? That just tells you that there's such a broken incentive structure in the society built on the fact that we have a culture of just having an open hand and giving people other people's money, basically, which needs to end. That's, again, a bigger macro discussion, but just, again, on this specific thing. Now, when you have the private sector taking on the production work, right, they're able to scale out. They're able to drive exports because they'll say, look, we've mastered the Fatah 4's production to the point where we're able to produce the cheapest cruise missile of this class, right? We can now go and compete the heck out of other markets. And then they can, set up a joint export subsidiary with the military if the military wants a cut of it, right? Like, they can set up another company to go and jointly export these things. It's fine, because it's the military's IP fundamentally, right? So the military still has a hand in it. It's not like the private sector is going to go and run away with all the profits. So there's a lot of these little avenues that you can explore that can help build that out. And the thing is, the mechanism is already there. So, people might say, well, why would the armed forces go and let the private sector go and build these munitions? What about all security controls, blah, blah, blah. That's true. But whenever you go to a defense exhibition, like Ideas or whatever, you will 100% hear GIDS, which is the marketing arm of NESCOM, promoting transfer of technology to potential customers overseas. So if you buy the Harba cruise missile, right, you will get some transfer technology to go assemble it in, Qatar or whatever. Because that's what you have to offer to get into these other markets. So I'm wondering, if you're going to offer it to people overseas who are not Pakistanis, why won't you offer it to Pakistanis to go build internally, like to the private sector? Because we know there's a lot of money literally sitting in land, not doing anything, right? Just going towards housing societies for whatever reason. This money could, these investors, if they're shown that here's how you build the Babur cruise missile or whatever, this is the inputs we need, this is stuff, many of them, I will guarantee you, because this is like sure money for them, they will go and pivot, right? They will pivot. They will say, okay, well, I'm going to stop spending on housing societies and I'm going to put it towards this stuff here. So the mechanisms exist. It's just that we don't tie them and connect them correctly. And this might be maybe just due to a lack of exposure of how business works around the world. In Pakistan lives in a little bubble. Pakistanis, unfortunately, we do live in a bubble where we assume just because of you spent X number of years somewhere, you're entitled to whatever, that you just have to get it, that you don't have to position yourself and provide a benefit. Maybe that's the reason that we don't do it. But I mean, anyways, the point being is that it's all there. The other thing I want to make a note of is that at the end of the day, like, we need to reduce or maybe make the state-owned infrastructure more efficient. So there are some things that maybe only the state can handle producing, like space systems, like aerospace, which is fine, right? You see that in Turkish with the Turkish industry. But again, at the end of the day, the risk is always there, especially when you get into these low-level things like, manufacturing assault rifles or bullets or bombs or whatever, or munitions. Like, the problem is that these low-level jobs, they just become a dumping ground for constituents. It's like it happens over and over again, right? It's to make people happy. And that's what government jobs are unfortunately used as everywhere, whether it's in the West or in the East or in third world or first world, is that they're used to make people happy. Whereas a private sector job, it's about making profit lines go higher and higher and higher, right? So that's my little spiel on why we need to offload the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, you explained it much better than I ever could. I mean, that's why you need a person in policy, right? And that was the opportunity that then, I was talking about, right? There's a huge opportunity if only we can grab onto it, right? Okay, but yeah. So there was another thing that I wanted to push this in there. It's not a smooth segue, but there's like a pet peeve or something that annoys me. So on PDF, which is the Pakistan Defense Forum, a lot of people are hung up on looking at NOTAMs and nav area warnings, and they're hoping for the next test to be the next best, longer range, faster, fancier missile system. Right? Not that SPD or SFC is looking at PDF, but there is like a general sense that people get disappointed when there's another test of Shine 1 or something. And I feel that's exactly the wrong kind of approach, because what I want to see instead is every 2 months there's a user acceptance trial Fatah 1s or Fatah 2s, right? And what that will show is we just produced, it was 2 months, and we just produced 30 Fatah 1s, and they're inducted into the army. In that sense, the message that we want to send, right? So we kept talking about conventional deterrence, right? That will establish conventional deterrence because India will see, hey, these guys are producing or importing or whatever this many number of systems. They have a large stockpile and they are not going to be afraid to use it in the next conflict. So I just want to say that, people on the internet, you can't make them do what you want, but it's better to look for user trials of existing systems that occur more often than just a single test launch of Ababil or Shine 3, which is a system that maybe you'll induct 10 of or maybe 20 of, and that's not really a system that you're going to use, right? It's primarily to scare the enemy, right? The thing that you're probably going to use are Fatah 1s and Fatah 2s and things like that. So we need to have much more acceptance of user trials of these systems. So that was just a tiny off-ramp rant that I wanted to put in.
Yeah, in relation to that, I think it would be good to see the armed forces engage in more of those like micro exercises, specifically to show that they're focusing on learning how to intercept certain sorts of threats and make that very clear. Like, for example, once they start, and I'm sure in the foreseeable future we'll start seeing talk about the FAS, surface launch FAS system coming into the picture. I think that same system will probably just use the SD-10 as well because we have a lot of those missiles on hand. So yeah, just go and say that we've been testing this every month against different targets, from loitering munition size targets to like potential fast to potential cruise missile targets. And just put that in your statements even, right? Because that'll show India that, okay, like these guys are actually training for war, and that's their job, and that's what they're doing. It's like they're building the processes again, they're reevaluating how they do things, they're adapting, and now they're going to be ready for the next conflict. And I think that is the lesson that, these exercises now should start articulating. And I think the Air Force and Navy had historically done a very good job of that, right? I mean, especially the Air Force, which was able to demonstrate that its exercises have been paying off operationally. And I think even the Navy is trying to sort of establish that, yeah, like it takes on exercises to go and adapt its doctrine and validate them. And it's very vocal about it. Like you hear about naval exercises like every few months, basically, and you might scoff at them, but I think if presented in a certain way, you begin understanding that these guys are serious. They're training and preparing for something. So from here up, we're just going to. So that concludes our main topic. So we did flip a few things, and normally would typically start with the week's defense news and then go into our main topic. But I think I agree with our audience members who sort of push back against that, saying that, hey, like we don't want to wait 30-40 minutes just for the main topic. So we've decided to flip the equation a bit. So we've front loaded the main topic. And that's been concluded, and now we're just going to go into a quick roundup of some interesting stories from this week, defense news stories, which I think are relevant to Pakistan. So the first one is that India has greenlit the procurement of additional Tejas Mark 1A fighters. So despite the development hell that poor fighter has gone through, I think this was the right decision given the circumstances. The Tejas, as much as people like to deride it for, again, project management, mismanagement, basically, it's in itself a good modern multi-role fighter. Yes, it hasn't been deployed yet. Yes, all that is true, but you can point some stuff out with Pakistani systems as well, right? It's like we haven't seen the Rad deployed in conflict yet. We haven't seen the Timur deployed in conflict yet, right? It doesn't mean anything like this. Like, I think again, people sort of get into a lot of narrative war stuff without evaluating the thing that they're talking about for its own merits. And I think when you look at the Tejas for its own merits, it's, I would argue, not that specific fighter in its specific configuration, but, I would argue had the PAF had a bigger budget at the time of the Super 7, it would have gone for a more complex design like that. It would have gone for a relaxed stability fighter. It would have gone for something more analogous to what the Gripen and the Tejas ended up being, as opposed to the JF-17, because there are some fundamental technology differences within them, right? Number one, the JF-17 it doesn't leverage relaxed stability for greater maneuverability. Initially the Block 1 was using a hybrid flight control system, right? Transitioned that to a fully digital flight control system, but not for the sake of maneuverability, but for space efficiency, power efficiency. So it's a very different approach. It worked for the PF, no doubt, but I would argue if you speak to the PF people who were in the project, you ask them if you had like $1 billion to spend on the R&D of a fighter, right? They would tell you what they would have gone for, and they would have gone for something more advanced and a bit more risky and complex, even if it meant going through the development hell. Because the thing is, development hell, it's not the development hell that's a problem, right? Yes, it creates timeline delays and what have you. It's the cost of funding that. Because at the end of it, you begin to master the critical technologies, right? So now India has a mastery of flight control technology. It has both the design mastery and industrial capacity to produce composite materials at scale. It knows how to forge aerospace grade steel, right? All these are critical things it had to learn for the Tejas program, and now that is beginning to basically manifest, right? I think they're going to have multiple, like we have one assembly line for the JF-17 and PSC Karma. They're going to have multiple assembly lines for the Tejas, right? Just to put that into perspective. So this will ensure that this is going to be their main, not only their main fighter, but it also ensures that the bulk of their defense spending gets rerouted back into India to support their local economy. And that's really the key that we Pakistanis need to be asking from our decision makers, is that what are we doing to ensure that the bulk of the public's tax money gets spent back in Pakistan? What do you think, Asim?
Yeah, totally agreed with everything you said. I'm not making excuses for Pakistan due to various, mismanagement reasons of Pakistan's economy and, mismanagement of Pakistan's security situation. Pakistan never had this space, to build its aerospace ecosystem like India has, right? Because, Pakistan does not have the budget or, the space to, take risks in terms of, its aerospace R&D, or, the strategic depth in terms of area, to be able to do all these things. So it operated on a very, does this get the job done mindset. So Pakistan never had that space, but India did have that space and has it, had that space, especially after 2000. Unfortunately, there have been some growing pains, right? So starting off, India hasn't done too well, as we know, with the mismanagement in the Tejas program, all those things. And I'm not saying that if Pakistan had the space, Pakistan would do any better. It would probably have the same problems, because essentially it's the same mindset across the border, right? But I'm just saying that India had that space and now is slowly learning how to use that space. And there's a thing about R&D. It's all about momentum. As you said, India has built up so many different capabilities. While people were making fun of the Tejas, it was making up those capabilities, right? So R&D is all about momentum, and now India has that momentum that it can take into the EMC, right? And yeah, so kudos to India for sticking to its R&D base, and that's what it really needs to do.
Yeah, and obviously they're now actively re-leveraging their existing partnerships with France to start supporting the AMCA project. So in that vein, they're looking to develop their own turbofan engines. Again, you want to make fun of the Kaveri, go ahead. But guess what? India has now domestic gas turbine expertise that they can now forward up to engage in collaborative projects. And they can go back to France and say, look, to the French, they can say, look, you either help us with this or there's no extra Rafale orders, right? You either help us with this or we're going to go talk to the South Koreans about the KF-21 and their domestic engine program. When India makes that kind of threat, it's going to be taken very seriously because they're such a big buyer, right? So they're beginning to sort of, I think, get everything in sync. And if you're a Pakistani decision maker, this needs to alarm you, right? You cannot live in Falala land and assume that these guys are going to constantly be behind. Because the thing is that the moment India gets a level of widespread competent leadership, it can be devastating for Pakistan, and that's what we saw in 1971 when that leadership for both the political, military, and what have you was in sync, and they knew what they were doing and executed. It was devastating, right? We lost our eastern half, and I know there's a bit of coping going on, saying, oh no, they would have gotten independence later, what have you, but come on, no one does that. No one lets go of territory, right? No one chooses to let their other half secede like that, right? There's always strength in unity, and I think we could have hinted towards that in the submarine discussion, that had an eastern flank been maintained, then Pakistan could have strategically squeezed India from both the Pacific and the Arabian Sea. We lost that capability, right? So there's a real cost to these things. And I argue again that this is a time for, yes, Pakistan's security economic situation has prevented it from taking this role, but I think ideally, we need the hawkish folks to, number one, if you're going to be hawkish, be seriously hawkish, like be objective, and start thinking in terms of actual nation building, right? Not just in reacting and lashing out and just living in delusion land, right? Rather, think about what it will take to achieve our military outcomes. So, for example, the whole private sector discussion thing, that was specifically aimed at the question of how do we scale up munitions production capacity to support Army Force Rocket Command. There are others, and you can go through our past podcasts as well, right? About how we can get into aerospace by specifically starting with UCAV drone technology and build upon that, right? There's so many different angles you can take, and it's all there. All the ingredients are there in Pakistan. They just need policy leaders to sort of mobilize them and put them together, like the same policy leaders who existed at the time of the 50s, 60s, and 70s to help our nuclear program get off its feet. That's what we need, basically. So next topic here is so Japan is testing Turkish male UAVs. Now, it's not specific to Japan, but I really wonder, like, what would it take for Pakistan to get its drones in other markets? Like, I know we have obviously a production bottleneck, so NESCOM or GIDS would have to pair any drone offering with a measure of domestic production, I imagine. But still, like, it's quite interesting to me that, you know, because we do have a pretty reasonable drone platform in the Shepherd series, but it doesn't penetrate to as many markets as the Turkish ones. What do you think, Asim?
Yeah, so I've thought about what you're saying, right? So I'm trying to speculate on a few reasons why that might be true. So let's think about our own armed forces. Even we inducted the Shepherds, but we also inducted Turkish TB2s and Akinchis and whatnot, right? So that should tell you maybe a few things, right? So maybe the quality of the systems isn't there yet, or maybe the production quantity isn't there yet, right? Or probably it's a combination of the two. And when I say quality, I don't mean the performance of the aircraft. I mean, I don't necessarily just mean that. The difference could be the user interface of the ground control station software, right? Like the way you manage your aircraft, or maybe there is a issue with reliability of data links or something, right? Maybe your Shepherd 2s crash too often as opposed to TB2s, which have a more reliable data link or something. There might be things with software. And the thing with this is something that all businesses will know. Products are always iterative, right? You sell a product, you get feedback on it, and then you correct things and then you sell it back. Because only the user can tell you all of the things that are, you know, that need improvement with your product, right? In Pakistan, and the only customer Pakistani organizations have had in a very limited capacity is just the PAF and the PA. The quality of the systems is probably holding our export potential back as well. So that's one reason. And then another thing is, this is not confirmed news or anything, but I suspect very strongly that some of our systems are using Turkish engines, right? So I don't know what the rules or the conditions on that the use of those engines are, right? So for example, we probably cannot compete with TB2s with Shepherd 2s because maybe the Shepherd 2 is using the engine from Turkey, right? And Turkey's like, hey, you can't do that, right? So that's something that, plays into these things as well, right? Because we have no ability to make diesel engines, right? So maybe that's something that Pakistan needs to focus on, right? Maybe, I don't know. But that might be another reason why, our export markets are restricted, right? Turkey might have the advantage there, right? Because they've sold their TB2s to lots and lots of people, right? So they have iterative feedback from their customers, and their user interface and their systems are probably very well refined as opposed to our Shapers, right? And our systems probably use, Turkish engines maybe, right? Or imported engines. And probably, as you pointed out, we don't have the production capacity to, meet orders. Some country might say we need 20 drones, by the end of this year. And Turkey will say yes, and Pakistan will say in 5 years. So that doesn't work. And another thing, this is something that's hard to quantify, is international reputation, right? So Pakistan doesn't have the reputation of, a great military supplier. So for example, Japan probably doesn't want to be seen buying Pakistani drones. even if they're the best in the world somehow, right? So there might be like a perception thing going on as well. But again, that can only change once you start making orders, right? So you would focus on markets that you can or get orders in, like Africa or the Middle East. You start building capacity, you start building orders. And I mean, that's how Turkey did it, right? And then you start build capacity, momentum, and then you'll get these big ticket sales.
I remember at the end of IDEF, I had a chance to just touch base with Asad Kamal, the CEO of GIDS. And we have an article that sort of goes into this in more detail. But basically his view is that, it'd be ideal if Turkey and Pakistan were collaborating more as opposed to competing in these redundant market areas. And just to build upon that, I think for Pakistan, especially if you had a good private sector, the opportunity is there to really help Turkey with their supply chains. Back in the day, and this is hindsight 2020, but back in the day when that TB2 was first tested, it would have been ideal, especially if the PFNU was going to end up acquiring that same exact drone, that they would have aligned both the Shepherd 2 and the TB2 projects because they're so similar, and that would have been one platform. And then you would have had a very heavy level, let's say 40 to 50% engagement of the Pakistani industry in every drone sold. So that would have been, our industry would have been involved in Ukraine, in Japan, wherever that drone goes, right? Had that step been taken earlier on, and then that goes back to, all that goes back to the gap of policy leadership, right? People who are able to sort of foresee these sorts of things. And again, for the record, folks, that forecasting was already there in Kua from 2015 onwards. Like, we've been talking about conventional deterrence for a long time. I think Asim, you will attest to this. Like, I was talking about using cruise missiles for conventional purposes for a very long time, and now everybody's suddenly like, yeah, we need it. Like, a lot of the stuff that's been on Kua for like a decade is suddenly started to surface. The ideas are starting to surface up on Twitter, X, and these places as if they're new. It's all been there. So again, you need that policy leadership to sort of identify these opportunities and sort of organize things to pursue them. But we just have so much security roadblocks within Pakistan, and obviously inefficient decision making and all this other stuff going on that prevents that, unfortunately. If that gets fixed or starts getting fixed in earnest, we have leadership in Pakistan that just decides, what, I just want to nation build. I want to get Pakistan out there. I want to build a sense of, I want people to respect my country, my people, wherever they go. So I'm going to now take things forward, whoever that might be. It's a bit of a messiah hoping here, but that's really if you have that kind of nation building class of people who finally take charge and push things, and then we can start seeing a lot of good change.
Yeah, let me just look at it as glass half full. So it could have been that the things that you were suggesting 10 years ago were never implemented. That would have been glass half empty. But eventually they did catch on, right? So they did start the conventional deterrence with the Rocket Force Command. So eventually they are listening to the core, right? So that's the bright side.
For sure. And I'm just going to make a note about that towards the end of the episode, because I do have a bit of an announcement. Just one last topic, which I thought was pretty fun and crazy, is that China has revealed a new coaxial helicopter, which looks very similar to the S-97 Raider. And I just feel like, and I think you're going to talk about this, but this is China's opposite problem, which is the surplus industrial capacity, so they can just go and pursue all these screw you projects, basically. It sounds like it's very hard to, and this is where we talk about the China, and this is not a critique of China as a supplier, but more if you're a Pakistani decision maker, is that in China you have all these diverse range of projects. It takes a while to know which one is going to stick, right? So, you could just jump on and get the S7 copy or whatever, or you can go and get whatever, but you need to be wary because the supplier for that might move away from that project and do something else. So that forces you to sort of tone down and look for the platforms that the Chinese themselves have adopted and are using, which is why you would select, let's say, a Z-10 attack helicopter as opposed to some other platform, right? That would be the reason why you would choose the Hungor submarine, the Type 039 platform, as opposed to commissioning China to build the original platform for you. So just a thought on that front.
Yeah, just like you said, so China has the opposite problem to Pakistan, that it has too much industrial capacity. And in a way, it's entirely opposite to Pakistan, but on a much bigger scale, right? So what I mean is, Pakistan's production and R&D capacity is design heavy, as you pointed out, right? So we do a lot of R&D, but our production is very, inefficient. There's basically no production. On the other hand, China has, compared to its production capacity, its R&D is small. Obviously, compared to Pakistan's R&D, China's R&D is ridiculously huge, but compared to its own production capacity, its R&D isn't as big as its industrial capacity, right? And the reason is its industrial capacity is huge. And it's probably easier for them to make everything they can, right? So you pointed this out. And then just see if it works or not. So instead of, laboring over, will this work? Is this a good idea? I mean, they have the luxury of just produce it, put it into trials, and see if it works or not. So I think that's basically the approach that they go for, based on the number of systems that they put out all the time. Another thing is, there's a lot of overhead that comes with R&D. So yes, they're doing their own R&D. They have original designs, obviously, but they have so much excess industrial capacity that they can also copy a design, not focus on the R&D, and just use their excess industrial capacity to copy and build something off the market. And they're obviously doing that. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Everyone has done that at some point in time. And if they have the excess industrial capacity to do it, why not, right? And maybe this is another opportunity for Pakistan, right? Because they have so much, excess industrial capacity, maybe we can and we should use some of that for getting some munitions for Army's Rocket Force Command.
Absolutely. And I think that's like, people say we're sort of these mindless critics of China, but no, we're just talking about how the Pakistani decision makers should approach China to get the maximum benefit, right? And this is an example of just that if the Chinese have all this excess production capacity right now, the good idea, especially, it's not just excess production capacity, it's like hyper efficient excess production capacity that inputs that would cost hundreds of dollars in some other place would cost like single digit dollars, if not even cheaper, in China, right? And that gives you the opportunity to start manufacturing things like loitering munitions at ridiculous scale, right? Including those like jet powered loitering munitions, right? At incredible scale. Same with like rockets and what have you. So you get those near term requirements fulfilled as rapidly as possible, because that's where your immediate fighting force mentality needs to kick in. And then you, in tandem, as part of your, let's say, 7 to 10 year project, you try building that capacity within Pakistan for that sovereign control element, right? And that's the sort of thing, that's the thing that we're trying to stress, is that work with the Chinese on the areas that they're the best at, where you're going to get the maximum benefit, especially where you're not going to get that anywhere else. And I'm not just talking about like being able to access high-tech equipment. It's this stuff as well, right? The scalability of your munitions production. Because even America, not yet at this point in time, can match up to that, right? So you have this really unique advantage over India in this sense that you should leverage. And that's the idea we're trying to sort of convey, is that take a nuanced approach and take things case by case, as opposed to having this wholesale doctrine of like, yeah, China, good, we're going to get everything from China, right? That's not the approach we should take. At the end of the day, national interest should always come first, and that should define decisions on a case-by-case basis. So once again, I thank everyone for listening to this week's episode. Stay tuned and see you next week. Take care and bye.